The pre-PDI attitude prevented good S-band high gain contact, and we had continual communications difficulty in this area, and finally yawed the spacecraft right between 10 and 15 degrees to give the high gain antenna more margin. This seemed to enable a satisfactory high bit rate condition, but it did degrade our ability to observe the surface through the LPD and make down and cross range position checks.
As I recall, and this is why I kind of like to have those tapes, there was a certain amount of manual tracking being done during this time with the S-band antenna. During the initial parts of powered descent, the auto track did not appear to maintain the highest signal strength. It dropped down to around 3.7, and the ground wanted reacquisition, so I tweaked it up manually. I got the impression that it was not completely impossible to conduct a manual track throughout power descent. You'd not be able to do very much else beside that. But I think it would be possible to do if you had sets of predetermined values that you could set in case you ever did lose completely.
At DOI ignition, which was our first dips maneuver, I could not hear the engine ignite, couldn't feel it ignite, and I wasn't, the only way I was sure that it had in fact ignited was looking at chamber pressure and the accelerometer. It's a very low acceleration level while you're at 10%. Just off zero. And
What's 10%?
Yeah.
Just doesn't put out the...
I think it would, after 0 G, it'd throw you against your straps one way or the other. It'd be very apparent.
now we're pulled down into the floor with the restraint already, and the difference between that and the 10% throttle acceleration was not detectable to me. However, at 15 seconds when we went to 40%, it definitely was. Our downrange position appeared to be good at the -3 and -1 minute point. The ignition point I did not accurately catch because I was watching the engine performance, but it appeared to be reasonably certainly in the right ballpark. Our cross-range position was difficult to tell accurately because of the skewed yaw attitude that we were obliged to maintain for comm. However, the downrange position marks after ignition indicated that we were long. Each one that was made indicated that we were 2 or 3 seconds long in range, and the fact that throttle up essentially came on time rather than being delayed indicated that the computer in fact was a little bit confused in what our downrange position was. Had it known what it was, it would have throttled down later based on engine performance so that we would still hit the right place if in fact it knew it was downrange by a couple of seconds. Then it would be late to throttling down so that it would brake more at a higher throttle level prior to the pitch. Landmark visibility was very good. We had no difficulty determining our position throughout all the face-down phase of powered descent, and correlating that with known positions based on the Apollo 10 pictures was very easy and very useful.
It was just about at the yaw around maneuver when we, well, I guess trajectory monitoring from the Diski up to that point agreed very closely, especially in H-dot and VI, with the values we had in the chart. The altitude values were, maybe off by something approaching 500 feet, but again, they were, quite close. It was almost immediately after yaw around that, as I recall, the altitude light went out, indicating that we had landing radar acquisition and lock-on. And what do you recall it being? 2,300 feet, something like that?
26 or 700, I believe, is the number I remember. I think it was plus 26 or 27. The yaw around was slow. We had inadvertently left the rate switch in 5 rather than 25, and I was yawing at only a couple degrees per second, as opposed to the 5 to 7 that we'd planned. And the computer would not hold this rate, say 1 to 2 degrees a second. It would was jumping up to 3 and back to actually changing the sign and stopping the roll rate. And it was then that I realized that clearly we weren't rolling as fast as we needed to be, and I noted that we were on the wrong scale switch. And, so I went to 25 and put in a 5 degree per second command, and it went right around. But this delayed us somewhat, and consequently we were at a slightly lower altitude at the completion of the yaw around than we had expected to be. So we were probably down to the area of 39 or 40,000 feet at the time when we had radar lockup, as opposed to about 41,000 that we expected to be at 41.5.
I guess the first indications we had of anything going wrong were probably around 5 minutes or something. When we first started getting program alarm activities.
After the 5 minute into descent, we started getting a series of program alarms, generally of the series that indicated the computer was being overloaded. Normally in this time period, we'd normally be evaluating the landing site and checking our position and starting LPD activity. However, the concern here was not with what was the landing area we were going into, but rather, could we continue at all? And consequently, our attention was directed toward clearing the program alarms, keeping the machine flying, and assuring ourselves that control was adequate to continue without requiring an abort. And most of the attention was directed inside the cockpit during this time period, and in my view, this accounts for our inability to study the landing site and final landing location during final descent. It wasn't until we got below 2,000 feet that we were actually able to look out and view the landing area.
Okay, I see something here that answers a question we had before about the AGS residuals and DOI. They were
7 minutes, 30 seconds into
1/10 before nulling, and we nulled them to 0.
altitude 16,000.
X was minus 0.1, Y minus 0.4, Z minus 0.1, and we nulled X and Z to 0.
Good.
And looking at the transcripts, we did have considerable loss of lock approaching PDI. And we did have to reacquire manually several times.
Roger, stand by. You're looking great at 8 minutes.
And it looked like we had some
760 feet per second. It's the P-64.
oscillations in the yaw
Roger.
angle on the antenna.
Fido says we're go. Altitude.
And the alarm that we had was 500. And we went to descent 1 and proceeded
feet per second. We copy.
in the computer, and then went back to auto again on the landing radar switch. And as this is prior to ignition again, and the ground recommended we yaw right 10 degrees.
You're looking great. Coming up 9 minutes.
We did not have the radar data feeding to the computer in the LGC position, but apparently even if you have it in auto track, why there's some requirement on the computer's time to
Altitude 4,200. You're go for landing. Over.
this is the way we'd been doing it
Go for landing. 3,000 feet.
in all simulations. It was our agreed on
1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're
method.
go. Same tide. We're go. 2,000 feet. 2,000
We were in sloop.
Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger.
Yeah, we were, prior to this time, we'd been in auto track until such time as we started to lose lock in the pitch over, and then we went to sloop.
Eagle looking great. You're go.
Isn't that right?
Altitude 1,600.
I'm talking about the program alarms during descent.
14,000 feet.
We'd passed
Very good.
the point of having the rendezvous radar in auto. We'd switched it over to slew at that point. Just left it there.
750
The
down to 23.
in the early phases of the P-64, I did find time to go out of auto control and into manual and check the manual control in both pitch and yaw, and found its response to be satisfactory, and then zeroed the air needles and went back into auto. Continued the descent in auto at that point.
400 feet down at 9. Gate forward. 1050 feet down
As
at 4.
we
33
approached the
down.
1,500 foot point, and the program alarm seemed to be settling down, and we committed to continue. We could see the landing area and the point at which the LPD was pointing, indicating we were landing just short of quite a large blocky rim crater surrounded with a large boulder field. I initially felt that might be a good landing area if we could stop short of that crater and find a suitable place, since it would have a lot of scientific value to be in that area close to this large crater. Upon continuing to monitor LPD with time, it was obvious that I would not be able to stop sufficiently short of that crater to find a safe landing area, and as soon as we determined that, we went into manual, and I pitched the vehicle over to approximately zero pitch, and I think I was in the 20 to 30 foot per second horizontal velocity region here, over the top of the crater and across the boulder field, and then proceeded to look for a satisfactory landing area at about 100 feet, or a little below 100 feet. I first noticed that we were in fact disturbing the dust on the surface, and we were beginning to get a transparent sheet of moving dust, which obscured the visibility a little bit. As we got lower, this visibility degradation continued to increase, and don't think that the altitude determination was severely hurt by this blowing dust, but the thing that was confusing to me was the fact that it was hard to pick out what your lateral and downrange velocities were, and that's because you were seeing a lot of moving dust. You had to look through that and pick up the stationary rocks and base your translational velocity decisions on that. And I found that to be quite difficult, more difficult than I thought it would be, and I spent more attention trying to arrest translational velocities than I thought would be necessary. As we got below 30 feet or so, and I had selected the final touchdown area, for some reason that I can't be sure, we started to pick up a left translational velocity and a rearward velocity, and that's the thing that I certainly didn't want to do, because you don't like to be going backwards and be unable to see where you're going. So I arrested the backward rate with some possibly spastic control motions, but was unable to stop the left translational rate. And as we approached the ground, I still had a left translational rate, and I was reluctant to shut the engine off while I still had that rate, and I was also reluctant to slow down my descent rate any more than it was, or stop it, because we were essentially close to running out of fuel, or we were hitting our abort limit. And so we continued right to touchdown in a slight left translation. The touchdown itself, I couldn't precisely tell. The Buzz called lunar contact. I never saw the lunar contact lights.
I call contact light.
And I'm sure you did, but I didn't hear it, I didn't see it. I heard you say something about contact, and I was spring-loaded to the stop engine position there, but I really don't know whether we had actually touched prior to contact, or whether the engine off signal was before contact. In any case, the engine shutdown was not very high above the surface. It was quite close. And the touchdown itself was relatively smooth. There was no tendency toward tipping over that I could tell. It just settled down like a helicopter onto the ground and landed.
You had a little, what I see here, right drift, and then I guess just before touchdown we were drifting left, huh?
I think I was probably over controlling a little bit in this lateral. I was confused somewhat by the fact that I couldn't really determine what my lateral velocities were as closely as I would like to, due to the dust obscuration of the surface.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward.
I could see rocks and craters through this blowing dust. I had picked it out earlier at a higher altitude. It was my intention to try to pick out the surface spot that I was going to land in at above 100 feet, and pick out an area just beyond it that I could keep my eyes on all the way down through the descent and final touchdown, so that I wouldn't, in fact, be looking at the place I was going to land. I'd be looking at a place just in front of it. And that worked pretty well, but again, I was surprised that I had as much trouble as I did in determining translational velocities and being able to control them. I don't think I did a very good job of flying the vehicle smoothly in that time period. I was a little bit erratic,
Okay, engine stop.
I think.
AGA at a descent. Mode control, both autos, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off.
The
I was
altitude,
feeding data to him all the time, and I don't know what he was doing with it, but that was raw computer data. Appeared to be
pretty good.
darn close.
Yeah, the computer data seemed to be pretty good information, and I would say that my visual perception of both altitude and altitude rate was not as good as I thought it was going to be. In other words, I was a little bit more dependent on the information. I think I probably could have made a satisfactory determination of altitude and altitude rate just by eye alone, but it wasn't as good as I thought it was going to be, and
50 down at 2.5.
I think that it's not nearly so good as it is here on Earth, let's say, flying with no big discipline.
8.5 down, 220 feet.
I got the impression by just glimpsing out that
11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet.
this was in the area of seeing the shadow the first time when I mentioned that.
Mhm.
Shortly after that, it seemed to me that the horizon out there tended to be obscured by a tan haze.
20 feet.
That may have been just an impression. Now, looking down at maybe 45 degrees, the velocity of the
185,
what was being kicked up seemed to be
75 feet. Started looking good, down a half.
no, not velocity, but the depth of it seemed to be fairly narrow. In other words, it was scooting along the surface. But since particles were being picked up and moved along the surface, you could see little rocks or little protuberances coming through this, so you knew that it was solid there. You got the distinct impression of that. It wasn't obscured to that point. But it did tend to mask out your ability to detect motion,
Down a half.
because there was so much motion of things moving out. You had to sort this out as to where it was coming from. There were these few little islands in here that were stationary, and if you could sort that out and fix on those, then you could tend to get the impression of being stationary with respect. But it was quite difficult to
Yeah,
do.
that's
and
right. It's a
nothing
little bit
that
like
in training.
a little bit like landing an airplane when there's a real thin layer of ground fog that you're coming through, and you can see things, through the fog. Except all this stuff was moving out all this fog was moving at a great rate, which was a little bit confusing.
And I would think that it would be natural that looking out the left window and seeing this moving this way, you'd get the impression of moving to the right, and you'd counteract it by going to the left, which is how we touched down.
Since we are moving left, we were yawed slightly to the left, so I could get a good view of where we were going. I think it was 13 degrees left, and consequently the shadow was not visible to me. It was behind the panel, but Buzz could see it. Then I saw it in the final phases of descent. I saw the shadow come in to view, and it was a very good silhouette picture of the LEM at the time I saw it, probably a couple 100 feet out in front of the LEM on the surface.
Well, here's
It's clearly a useful tool, but I just didn't get to observe it very long.
Here's an entry, 46 seconds, 300 feet. 4 seconds after the next minute, watch your shadow. And at 16 seconds, 220 feet. So I'd estimate that I called out that shadow business at around 260 feet. And it was certainly plenty large at that point. And looking back on it, I would have said that at 260 feet, that shadow would have been way the hell and gone out there, but it wasn't. It was a good-sized vehicle. I could tell that we had gear down and that we had an ascent stage and a descent stage, and it was, of course, illuminated around it with the zero-phase sun. So there was a brightness in the vicinity, but it was readily identifiable, and had I looked out sooner, I'm sure I could have seen something identified as a shadow at 400 feet maybe higher, I don't know. But anyway, at this altitude, it was usable. Just how you sort that into all the rest of the things that you're looking at, since the ground is moving, why, it might be of some aid. But of course, you have to have it out your window.